I'm Rana Foroohar. I'm an associate editor and the global business columnist at the Financial Times. In the year that I've been at the Financial Times, I've been writing a lot about concentration of power, tech, and the whole new landscape that we talked a lot about in the last panel. I just arrived today, actually, and I was kind of blown away by that panel. So thanks, everybody that was on that panel, and thanks, I don't know where Adam is, but thanks, Adam, for having such a great discussion. So this panel is going to be on whether government can resist corporate influence. We framed it as the Big Five and their influence in Washington, how that's been growing, how that's brought dominance and potentially more market consolidation, and whether or not the government in the US, Europe, and elsewhere have treated these companies differently than other industries, and whether or not digital platform firms are just simply more influential in some way that's different. So I'll just quickly run through the folks on our panel. I'm sure you know everybody here, but we've got Tim Wu from Columbia Law School, and author of The Attention Merchants, which is an awesome book. We have Daniel Stevens, the executive director of the Campaign for Accountability, Google Transparency Project. To my right, the amazing Luigi Zingales from U of Chicago, and author of Capitalism for the People, which I love. And on his right, Alejandra Palacios Prieto, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, the competition commissioner from Mexico. And finally, at the far end here, Randal Picker from the University of Chicago Law School. So thanks so much, all of you, and hello to those that I haven't met yet. So I am sort of, in my own mind, I'll just set the frame maybe by saying I've been thinking a lot about the current debate around concentration of power and comparing and contrasting it to the pre- and post-2008 debate around finance and concentration of power. And one thing I would say that I think last session was great because there's a lot of de-siloing that's going on. One thing that seemed to happen to me 10 years ago around the financial crisis was that we had a core problem. Wall Street was not serving Main Street in some profound way. We needed to fix the entire system. Folks kind of broke that into different baskets, and people came at it in different ways, and there were some good rules and bad rules, and many of them canceled each other out, and I'm not quite sure you fixed the problem yet. So is there a way to think about the problem of concentration, which I think nobody would disagree with, today differently? And what, if anything, has changed? So Luigi, I'm going to actually start with you, since you are the big theory guy, and ask you what you think is different in the debate now versus 2008.
I think that in the entire political economy literature, there is a debate about the influence of companies, and in particular corporate lobbying. I think that to some extent, that literature is misdirected because the corporate lobbying, at least the way we measure it, is trivial. And so if you think about Google spends, what, 20 million in official corporate lobbying? They probably spend more money in their cafeteria in Mountain View. So
really good smoothies.
And so I don't think that this is what makes the difference. What makes the difference is the ability to influence at a higher level. I thought that Monty's speech was very insightful because he said basically the American companies screwed up and they're learning how to do lobbying, which was very helpful for him to stave off the lobbying that they were doing. And they played by the rules. And so when you go to a different country, I remember going to, and this I'm touching a sensitive nerve because I'm touching a journalist, but I went to Moscow in 2003, 2004, to study how the media in Moscow and international media in Moscow. And at the time, the local oligarchs were completely incompetent on how to deal with the media because they were going to the Financial Times with a check. And of course, if you go to the Financial Times with a check, you're kicked out from the back door.
Right. You have to go to the business side.
You have to be more sophisticated than that. Yeah. And for example, there was, on the other side, Bill Browder, who was actually preparing a memo for not just the Financial Times, all the international media, with a reference, etc., making very easy to write on that side. And actually, I wrote an article about the success of Bill Browder, and everybody was asking, how can you explain that one Bill Browder can fight against a lot of oligarchs? Yeah. And my answer was,
it's a disequilibrium phenomenon because pretty soon the oligarchs will know how to deal with the international press and will be a different game. So I think that in Europe, the time of Mario Monti was a time in which they didn't know how to deal with that. And the other thing that Monti did not say is there is a democratic deficit in Europe. And in general, that's terrible. In this case, might be useful because they're isolated from everybody, including the lobbyist. Okay, so there is a redeeming feature on that. But I think that in a democratic country like the United States, the power is enormous. And I don't know. I think he has left, but I don't know to what extent I have to believe what Robert Epstein is saying. If this is what he's saying is true, I think sorry my French, we're screwed. Because if really just by ordering the search in Google, you can influence voters. But do you think that any politician will ever go against Google or Facebook? Says the stuff that we're seeing in Congress is really a side issue. Because honestly, if you think that 160,000 of ads can change an electoral campaign, we should fire all the political consultants because they spend billions. So if with 160,000 well placed, Russia can influence an election, we should fire all political consultants. I don't think that's what is happening. But if you can influence millions of people by ranking, I think that that's what is really important. And let's face it, I don't know where is the guy from Facebook, but I would like to confirm this. I read an article on reputable sources by a political scientist that say that both Twitter and Facebook allow embedded political consultants from both parties in their offices. And those help out to win a campaign.
Yeah.
That's the kind of lobby that is very difficult to do.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that the only solution is a structural remedy that the political consultants cannot talk to Google and Facebook and Twitter, and there should be complete separation. That's the only way which you're going to get some regulation of these companies. Otherwise, both parties are completely embedded. It's not a question of Democrats versus Republicans because they both depend crucially on the social media. And so the social media are really the power of the future.
Okay, so wow, a lot packed into what you just said, which is great. I mean, this conference, every single comment we could have a whole discussion group on. Let me pull back. The Google case study is actually interesting. I mean, we talk a lot about Facebook recently, but Google is interesting, and the last panel touched on this. You could argue perhaps that company has had more influence than any other. And Dan, I know this is something you think a lot about on the political process, certainly during the two Obama terms. So head of Google IP became the head of the USPTO. One of the issues that came up in the Facebook-Russia 2016 election meddling is the fact that both the left and the right have used these same techniques, as you say, and it's sort of interesting to me. I mean, the Obama team did not, you could argue, did not use these techniques in the same nefarious way, perhaps, although maybe not. It's a fine line to slice. So clearly, there's been a single company that has had incredible influence. Dan, you've studied this, you've tallied the numbers. Tell us a little bit, maybe just to help ground this in reality, how you see the influence of Google and the other big tech companies in Washington, and how does that differ? I mean, frankly, how is that different from, Jamie Dimon going to talk to Treasury or any other past paradigm?
Sure. So my organization, Campaign for Accountability, we run the Google Transparency Project, and we've done a lot of work on Google's influence in Washington. And the statistics are sort of startling. They had a meeting at the White House once a week with the Obama administration. They had 250 revolving door hires that left government to work for Google. Sure, other industries do this, other tech companies do this, but Google does it on a much bigger scale than the other companies, than the other tech companies. And so that's what separates them from the other companies under discussion today. What separates them from JP Morgan and other industries is that there's still a lot of goodwill for Google and other tech companies in DC that there's maybe not for the banks or not for oil companies or tobacco or Monsanto or companies like this, right? So they can be incredibly close to the Obama administration, and they can escape criticism for that because it's Google, because it's Silicon Valley, and because it's not Halliburton during the Bush years, which did draw a much different level of criticism than Google has with the Obama administration.
That's interesting. I mean, I would actually push back a little on the idea that they're, I mean, I think that they are still close on both sides of the aisle, but it seems that the goodwill may be diminishing.
So I'm talking historically, certainly, right? So in the last couple of years, I think what's really notable is when Google pushed out open markets out of the New America Foundation, which has been defended, but I think that shifted a lot of the focus in Washington.
Right.
And so I think it shifted lately, but historically, they were first and bigger than other industries.
Right, okay.
Sorry, can I add one
Yeah,
thing?
go ahead.
I think it's important. I think what you said is absolutely right, but there is an additional difference. Is JP Morgan, and I'm the first one to criticize them, so I don't want to defend them, but JP Morgan can only provide money to whoever politician is running. Google and Facebook can provide money and votes.
Right.
And there's only one thing that is more valuable to politicians than money is votes. and I think that's the reason why they're so much more powerful. It's not even funny.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I don't know that there's been evidence of that happening yet. I mean, maybe Dr. Epstein
But
is
you
right.
know, just the threat. Benjamin Franklin said, "You never pick a fight with somebody who buy ink by the barrel." Okay, you know that a journalist is potentially a threat, so you generally try to be nice. Okay, and if you actually print on the internet by the barrel, then it's
Sure.
Okay, so Tim, let me bring you in because I know you have thoughts on the entire theory of concentration and political influence.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I want to say one thing about what Luigi's talking about. What's interesting about what you're talking about is actually that it brings up a different body of law than antitrust, and brings us into sort of FCC land. The similar, and also, this debate is what you're talking about is also centrally focused on this question of whether tech companies are media companies or not, which is a perennial. Because obviously broadcasters, starting from the 30s, it started to be noticed that broadcasters might have an ability to influence elections, and people thought that might be a concern. They started to exercise some of that influence a little bit. And so there are regulations, I don't want to say they're perfect or perfectly successful, but the FCC has regulations which are designed to kind of get rid of the most obvious ways that the broadcasters could sway local elections. One example is they're supposed to have the same advertising rates for both candidates. So you can't sort of just say, okay, hey, do you want free advertising? We're going to give you free advertising, give your opponent whatever if you agree with these policies or something like that. So there are, and that might be an interesting place and a different kind of angle on this whole are they a media company issue. This topic we have on this panel is subject to a lot of ways of looking at it. And let me turn to sort of the antitrust. I think that's I see that as more of in my law professor way, as an FCC kind of thing. I'll talk a little bit more about the antitrust side of things. So one thing I think that antitrust people like to think, and we can debate whether it's true or not, is that antitrust, because it has this adjudicatory or prosecution-driven method, is more immune to political influence or more insulated from political influence slightly than your average agency rulemaking. That at least is the I don't know if it's a mythology or the theory. And I think we're starting to see whether they think that's true or not. Not just sticking with big tech, but the debates surrounding whether Trump feels he can order antitrust prosecutions to happen is starting to bring that into question. But I think there's another thing that should be part of this debate. From the early days of antitrust, one of the great concerns that antitrust was originally designed to deal with, and I identify this both with people like Brandeis, but also Theodore Roosevelt, was the problem of corruption, the problem of excessive concentration yielding too much political power. I think that is, if you go back to if you go back to actually why Roosevelt brought the first important antitrust case against Morgan, Northern Securities case, he was like, we need to see whether in fact we can control these trusts or not. We need to see who's really in charge of this country. and whether there's an invisible government that it basically runs economic policy, and that was designed to test that proposition. So the entire antitrust enforcement origins lie in this political side. And I know you discussed this last year, but I think it's time to reinvestigate that, and I think we have better tools to understand why that kind of thing would happen. You don't have to be a genius economist to understand Manker-Olson's point that small concentrated groups tend to have disproportionate influence over government. And the basic basic game theory is overcoming a collective action problem. It's easier to do that with a small concentrated group. That's his point. And therefore, if you don't do effective merger, if you don't do any effective merger enforcement, if you allow concentration to grow, I think it's very predictable you'll end up with industries that have disproportionate influence on government. And so there is more than one, there's a lot of debate as to what antitrust is about, but you can see the goal of protecting competition as mirroring or also carrying out the goal of fighting political corruption or undue influence on concentration. And I think maybe that's what agencies should start understanding as part of their mandate. A lot of the stuff we're talking about is a lot harder to happen if you don't have a dominant, still have concentrated industries.
So
I'll
bringing,
stop there because I'm going.
No.
Yeah.
This is, I'm great. It's great. I'm glad you've kind of added the historical frame. So basically what you're saying is we need to bring the idea of political influence into the antitrust discussion in an explicit way and include it in the calculus.
Include it in the rationales for why antitrust goals include protection of competition.
Yeah.
Now, Luigi's talked about this a lot as well, and I'm a little nervous of duplicating one of last year's panels. But yeah, I think that it's not difficult to see that among the values protected by an antitrust, which is designed to protect competition, protect a more decentralized economy, is to make it harder. Some of the things you guys are talking about of having one industry. I don't care if it's Google or AT&T or look at it. Google is influential, but let's look at AT&T in the 60s and its influence over the FCC. If you want to see real industry capture, you need to get more serious about this. Let's talk about a government, a company that oversaw part of the American nuclear arsenal, right? And so therefore, in charge of nuclear weapons programs and part of the defense industry, frankly. That is what you call real influence, and that was a product of a long-standing government-supported monopoly and an almost predictable outcome of that. And maybe that's our part of our lesson. It's part of what antitrust law should be doing. I think a lot about AT&T is preventing that level of unity between government and major industries, which frankly has a more of a political theory. It starts to look like a fascist form of government. I don't really know.
Great.
No, but I mean when you have a complete union, we have a complete union of industry and government. What kind of form of government is that? You tell me. Now that I know the word fascist is a little strong. Yeah. But I'm just saying that.
No, actually, it's not so. I was moderating at the IMF yesterday, and this topic actually came up. So anyway, that's another conversation. But Randy, let me jump to you because you've also got thoughts on the historical frame. You're working on a book right now looking at the history of regulation around technology in the computer industry. What other points would you call out that we should be thinking of looking at for a historical framework here?
Good. So where Tim just was so interesting, right? So and I couldn't tell whether you do or don't believe in natural monopolies, right? So I think we divide the world into, from a competition standpoint, into two worlds. Things that we think antitrust should address. And if we think it's a natural monopoly, part of yesterday's discussion, antitrust is supposed to step back and we look to other regulatory frameworks to deal with that. Now, if something's a natural monopoly, to break it up because we think that would be fun or because it would reduce its political influence, I'm not sure if that's useful. AT&T, I think you're right, it's a wonderful example. When I'm this historical book I'm doing, I think the 1949 antitrust case against AT&T is hugely important. Right. The 56 settlement, a little discussion yesterday about how that opened the world of transistors right at the point where they're coming out. So hugely important. At the same time, when the Department of Justice is suing AT&T, the Defense Department is saying, we're fighting in Korea. How can you do that to us right now? You can't. What I want to say is I don't claim myself knowledgeable about defense policy, but I assume that the role AT&T was playing there was because they were actually probably the best people to be doing that. And you've seen in the last couple days, I'm sure, this idea that there's going to be almost a pact among Silicon Valley firms not to do AI on behalf of the federal government. Okay, I understand why you might want to do that. At the same time, defense efforts are really important.
Also, P.S., a lot of work with the DoD.
Of course.
You know,
Of course.
We're
Right?
gonna-
So I don't know that again, AT&T, it's so much fun to talk about it, but I'm not quite sure what the framing is there.
Okay, I'll
which
tell
is-
you what it is. Can I tell them what it is?
Yeah.
Well,
Go for it.
Actually, I
One of us
welcome the
knows,
opportunity.
Tim.
I
Let's
welcome
go.
the opportunity to be in a debate with a professor at the Chicago
That's why we're here.
Chicago Law School, and therefore you're going to stand in for the Chicago School of Antitrust and insist to me that a natural monopoly is not a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, you know what I mean?
Do you not believe in natural monopoly, Tim?
What? So let me finish.
that a
I'm just saying.
category
I'm just
that
saying it
exists?
can be a self-fulfilling
Tim and I
prophecy.
have co-taught together. So
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give you guys one. I'm going to give you guys 1 minute apiece, and then we're going to go on to Alejandra. Go ahead.
We're usually on the opposite side of this argument. That's all.
Okay.
And so, I think natural monopoly, the proclamation that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy and a dangerous one. If government says, "All right, this is a natural monopoly," you know, the AT&T example again, you know, we're going to give up on trying to do anything about to protect competition or encourage it, and I think that you know, things can change. What yesterday's natural monopoly is sorry, so you don't disagree with that.
Of course.
But anyway, even if you're going to accept a natural monopoly in some part, there's still a lot of work to do vertically.
Fine.
There's still a lot of work to do vertically.
I don't
and
disagree.
you know what I mean? And still a lot of work to think about the corrupting effects of a natural monopoly. All right.
Okay, we'll come back, I'm sure, to some of these threads. But Alejandra, I want to pick up and get your perspective on international cooperation or the lack thereof around monopoly issues and big tech. I mean, one thing I mentioned the IMF meetings. One thing that came up, I did an interview with David Lipton yesterday, the first deputy managing director, and he made the point that you know, there is a first of all, he said that trust, trade, and tech were the biggest worries, and the interplay between those things around global growth going forward. And he made the point that, you know, we're living in a perimeterless world as far as these companies go, and in some ways the ascendancy of data, you know, as the new most important commodity, actually puts the problems of neoliberalism on steroids. You know, it's more important than ever to have a global framework, and yet it gets harder to do that. So let me just lay that out there to you. How are you experiencing that on the ground?
Well, thank you very much. I just, before answering your question, I'd like to talk upon
Yeah, go ahead.
some of the points they talked. First, I would say that antitrust agencies are quite independent in terms of political cycles. I think that's important to say. And that competition policy in the digital area is the hot topic in terms of what we discuss when different competition authorities get together. So let me give you some examples. We'll have we'll have an OECD competition meeting this next June, and basically the roundtables are on non-price effects on mergers, e-commerce and competition, market concentration, and there will be an initial discussion in blockchain and competition. So we are worried about these issues. Then I would like to particularly say, and I'm not talking for all the heads of agencies, just for myself, that antitrust is not good for fixing structural issues. And I'll give you 2 examples from the Mexican economy. One is we have a bread company who owns basically all the bread market in Mexico. If you analyze its Herfindahl index for loaf bread, it has like 9,876 in the Herfindahl index. It has everything. So they tell you, you know, there's a monopolized market there, why aren't you doing anything? And if you use traditional antitrust tools, it's very difficult to do something because there's nobody in the market in there, so he won't collude with nobody else. And then on the other hand, competitors long time ago laid back from trying to enter the market. So he has high prices, but not enough high prices so that no entrants want to come in. So if you want to use traditional competition tools to eliminate that concentration, basically it's impossible. The other example is we have a monopoly in telecommunications. The telecom company has more than 70% in fixed mobile and line telephony, And what the Mexican government did is, by law, it created a law that says that if anybody in telecom sector has more than 51%, then he'll have asymmetric regulation. That's basically the only way you can go in with a market that's that concentrated. So as it's been an interesting antitrust conference, because we've talked just very little about antitrust, because I think the conversation has been moving from antitrust needs to fix these issues to what else has to be done because antitrust is limited. So at least the conversation is evolving in that way. And in terms of international cooperation, when apart from all these roundtables and discussions on how to best apply our tools in the digital area, there's other issues regarding, for example, if you do a downgrade to a company. Normally that company would have servers within his office. Now the servers are in India, or the servers are China, or whatever, no? So you do need international cooperation to do your traditional work in this new digital era.
Well, so let me follow up with one question. Someone gave an interesting example to me the other day of, on a trade deal, let's say, how do you even think about origin rules when you're doing 3D printing? I mean, what? Are we going to have to renegotiate every trade deal? You know, are people talking about this? Because I feel like in Washington, I'm having a totally siloed conversation about all these different areas, which is very disturbing because I think there is a great risk of a post-2008 regulatory environment where you end up with a kind of a morass of things that maybe don't solve the underlying problem.
I hadn't had that question made to me before.
Okay, all right. We'll bookmark that guy for the next round.
No, but yes, also, apart from what we've been discussing these days in terms of Facebook and Google,
yeah.
there are other issues that technology and the digital area is doing because it's getting us all together in the same geographical market.
Yeah.
And the rules are made as we are apart. No, we're different agencies. We have different jurisdictions. The same happens with trade. So yeah, those are going to be interesting questions.
So let me apologize because I was not here yesterday. So if I'm repeating some things, please forgive me. But it seems like just from the last couple of sessions that we're sort of we're talking about baskets of issues. One of them is antitrust. One of them is privacy, civil liberties, how surveillance and big data are going to work. And another is patents and property rights, digital property rights. When you all, I want to kind of just throw out a broad question to anyone who wants to take it. When you all, would you agree that those are the main baskets? Are there anything else that you would include? And how should we think about monopoly power and government influence in these baskets? And how can we bring all this together and think about it constructively?
First of all, if you ask me, the list is excellent. I will add that there is a media component that is quite important in the mix. I think that one thing, and actually I was taking notes because I have to summarize at the end of my the conference. I think that one of the things I learned here is that the world is much more complex and interactive than our disciplines allow. So each one here is a specialist in a little area. That's the reason why we're here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. The world is much more complex.
Except me,
and
specialist in nothing, which is why I'm moderating.
No, but I think that helps connect. Actually, sometimes being especially in nothing allows you to see the world in a much more rich way than all of us that have tunnel vision. In order to be a successful academics. And I don't know in other businesses, but probably it's true in other businesses, you have to have tunnel vision and you have to be really focused on very little but go very deep in that, which is great. But when it comes to public policy, this attitude is not going to fly. So I think that one thing that I would like, and I elaborate at the end, but one thing I would like to take away from this is the need to address these things together. Because if we play the game of this is not antitrust, this is not privacy. Each one looks at a little thing, and I would like to take inspiration from Jean Tirole, who has written a book about economics for the common good. As economists, you tend to look at the social welfare and say, look, honestly, I don't care whether this is part of the FCC, antitrust, or whatever. I care about changing the world to make it a better place.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do we, of course, all this information is extremely important, how do we derive the details? Because going from the 10,000 level principle to actually, you have to change this article on the FCC rule,
Yeah.
or you have to do that is a huge step.
Yeah.
And I think we need all the help of all the people in this room to make those steps.
For sure. Alejandra, you want to jump in?
Yes. Well, when, at least my experience, when you analyze market concentration, basically the explanation has to do with in my view, two answers. One is the lack of laws, regulatory laws, that you have a market that's prone to concentration, and then the lack of regulatory laws takes you there quite quickly. Or the other part is the lack of enforcement of the laws, which happens a lot, at least in my country.
Both.
Or a lack of both, yes. And of course, market concentration generates market power, and that generates political power, and that entrenches regulation. So that's a vicious circle we need to break. In terms of silos and who is doing what, maybe antitrust agencies with their tools are not the answer in terms of generating regulation to diminish that concentration. But what we can do, and we should be doing, is a lot of advocacy effort. We should understand the challenges we're facing today, and we should raise our voice and talk about these issues, because at the end of the day, they are competition issues. They're just not solved with antitrust tools. They're solved with other tools. But we can
Or they're not solved at all.
But they should be solved. They should be solved. The answer is they might not be solved with antitrust tools, but they might be solved with other regulatory tools, and we need to push that forward, and that's part of the agenda that we should work on because you can see an antitrust agency as an ombudsman for competition issues. It's not that you enforce the law, it's that you're an ombudsman so that markets work efficiently. So,
Do you want to jump in, Tim?
Yeah,
Did you
I'll
want
jump
to?
in.
Yeah,
Go.
yeah.
Tim can go first. Go, Tim.
Yeah.
You want to go?
No, you go.
So then we can have a fight again. I like that.
Fair enough.
Good. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I think there's a real danger in some, given the fact that we're talking about so many fields here, of kind of a buck passing that can happen. And it happens a lot in Washington, where you'll be like, well, you know, two agencies I'm pretty well acquainted with, the FCC and Antitrust. Oh, let's leave this to Antitrust. You know,
Yes,
they're the ones to take care of this problem. Well, oh no, but Antitrust doesn't. Antitrust is very focused narrowly on allocative efficiency. We can't take care of these broader issues. Those are clearly for the FCC, and so the result is, oh yeah, we're not going to do anything ever. Or you know, like price fixing cartels. We got that. So that's a real danger of some of this of what we're talking about. If you had trade policy to it, you could say, well, maybe this is really a trade issue. So I think that's a problem. I want to talk about antitrust's political role, and go back to Bob Potofsky's writing. I think Bob he has this famous piece in 1979 about political antitrust, and I think it's time to think about that. One of the things he said in it, which I think is really interesting, going back to our conversation about democracy, is he was saying, you know, is it just a coincidence that in countries that you very rarely see a correlation between a truly democratic form of government and absolutely concentrated industries in every sector? He started asking whether maybe those are incompatible or not. Now he's just kind of speculating, but I think it's not worth ignoring that. And I do think now there's a serious comeback which says, you know, antitrust can embarrass itself when it takes on too many jobs. You know, it has a few things that maybe House understand. It's got a lot of expert economists, some in their room, and it's better at just trying to keep at its narrower narrower goals. But I've come to increasingly think that's not true. And I want to go back to the AT&T case as the greatest example why I think that's not true. I think anyone in this room would agree that the greatest barrier to entry, I mean, there's all kinds of great barriers to entry, but the greatest one is get government on your side. Right? If you really want, whether it's using patents, whether it's using exclusive franchise, whether it's using some licensing, trade, whatever it is, you got government on your side. That is the best barrier the best barrier to entry you got going, or way of raising rival costs. And if government is kind of the accomplice to entrenchment of monopoly, there is no real remedy through the normal regimes, and that kind of has to be antitrust's role. I mean, that's what I think the AT&T litigation starting in the 70s, kind of surprisingly by the Nixon administration, is so interesting in the sense that they started to realize, the FCC wasn't really going to be able to handle this, and that antitrust kind of had to have a final check on political power. And I think we need to think about that as we think about big tech. I don't know if we're exactly there yet, but if we start to see entrenched monopolies, no way around them, they seem to have recruited government to their side, I think that's kind of time you need to start thinking about antitrust.
I want to come back on another topic with you, but go ahead, Randy.
So I just want to come back to your original list, I guess. And I would have said one of the great issues of the day is the question of interconnection.
Yeah.
And that's an old issue. It goes back to the telegraph, obviously the railroad, and the telephone system. And I think the discussion we've heard yesterday and today about the Facebook Cambridge Analytica situation demonstrates how difficult that is, right? So Facebook, as it were, opens up in 2007. I don't know if the Facebook guy is still here or not. You can tell me I have this wrong. They roll out an open API, right? If you're someone who believes in interconnection and fostering competition, that's great. Right? That's what we want. People typically try to block that. But the problem of that is getting that right turns out to be hard. And the Cambridge Analytica situation is sort of the natural consequence of that. That raises the privacy issues. Now, we could say, prior panel, maybe we should have mandated APIs and regulation of those. At the same time, if you ask how does the government regulate sort of in a granular level technology, everyone looks at software patents and say, boy, that's been an awful regime. So the ability of the government to do that seems limited, and it's precisely this intersection of antitrust and privacy and sort of traditional communications issues. I don't want to call it buck passing. I just think it's really, really hard.
Luigi, you want to jump in?
Rana had a very interesting point at the beginning, saying, why don't we learn from what has been done in the financial industry? And I think that one of the things that was done after the crisis was to realize that the old regulators were too segmented because each one was looking at his own little silos. And of course, the crisis always takes place in the cracks. And so it was created a financial stability board. I'm not so sure it works so well, but at least the idea is a good idea, which is to bring everything, everybody under the same table and discuss this. So I think that one of the things that could emerge from here is we need something like this in this arena. I think that thinking about regulating tech is not just an antitrust issue, it's not just an FCC issue, it's not just a privacy issue, it's all of the above together. And if we have segmented regulation, we're never gonna fix the problem because Facebook correctly say, oh, we open the API, but there's a privacy issue. And so now all of a sudden they're concerned about privacy because it's their interest to use that. And until the day before, they couldn't be concerned, but now they use privacy. How could you possibly dare doing that? And they are right, there is a privacy issue, but we don't want that overblown. So we need a common board.
I think that this is actually a huge issue, and it's interesting. I've been hearing even within the EU that there's a battle going on between competition and innovation. There's regulatory arbitrage within country, within region. Tim, do you agree with this? Do we need some kind of, I don't know whether you call it a tech stability board or a tech FDA or something where all these issues would live? Is that?
I would make it broader than the tech industry, and I'll explain what I think the institution should be, if you don't mind. But I want to try to concretize this concern. So, with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, obviously a lot of sense that we should do something about it and privacy regulation. And what Luigi's hinting at is the danger. It's an uncomfortable danger to point out to privacy advocates If you do it wrong, you make Facebook the established church of social media. In other words, you do it, kind of
yeah.
Kingsbury commitment kind of thing, and you create a framework which, one way is you're increasing the fixed costs of being a competitor in here because you need to understand the regulatory framework at all to get started, or you basically create a briar patch, which is like, oh, don't throw us in the briar patch, but basically we understand the briar patch better than anyone else, and so it ends up a lot more like telecom, where it's very challenging for entrants because they need to understand the regulatory system first. So how do you deal with it? One idea, in my brief time in the White House, one thing we were trying to do is to have the National Economic Council kind of an adjunct to OIRA. This is going to get very admin law, but in the White House, kind of an adjunct to OIRA.
Oh, go on. You're amongst your
try to
people.
have an office which tries to think about the unintended anti-competitive consequences of regulation, or try to squash anti-competitive regulation, or try to use regs to break or decrease barriers to new entrants. And so to use because most of the regulatory state, as you said, is siloed, they're concerned with their things. I mean, that's a bigger deal in healthcare than it is in tech. Because in healthcare, they're always writing regs which supposedly are about safety or security, but then somehow mysteriously only the incumbents are able to work in the space anymore. There was one rule I remember, some equipment repair rule that was probably still ongoing, where the FDA was going to say no, the only people who can repair the equipment are the original manufacturers. With this new rule making to just make it that way, and that kind of thing's going on all the time. And so I think having just a tech one would not be a good idea, but having this roving authority in the White House, which is kind of constantly trying to look out for these problems, and hopefully itself doesn't get corrupted. I don't know how to do that part, but but you know what I mean. Themselves doesn't get corrupted.
Dan and then Alejandra.
Well, I'm sort of, these are all great ideas, but let's come back to the real world, right? Where
that was the real world we were doing that.
Right. But of that, but trying to regulate tech, right? We're in this position where it's incredibly hard to do anything in our government. There's just almost nothing getting done.
Right.
So the idea of an entire new bureaucracy to try to regulate this giant, powerful industry seems so unlikely. Maybe it's an open market initiative that's going to come back. Free markets will solve this problem, but right now, the way our political system is set up, I think we have to figure out some political changes.
Also, I think it's worth bookmarking, and then Alejandra, I want to come to you. This is not just about the FANGs. We're talking about a data economy. We're talking about data being the new oil, it being collected by every possible industry, and so it's not just about tech. But go ahead.
Yes.
Our government regulators.
Please. Yes, exactly.
Well, I believe that the FTC is well equipped in the sense that it has both competition and consumer bureau and consumer and privacy issues. So what could happen at that agency, at least, is that you have an issue, and it's a competition privacy issue, and as you analyze it, then you can decide if it will go into one bucket, the other, or the other. In the Mexican case, for example, we have a competition agency, the one I chair, we have a consumer bureau, and then we have a privacy bureau. That's really complicated. And one of the things I'd like to push in my agenda is to merge these things together, because I do believe that at least these things do need to come together in like a 21st sector, 21st century economy, as competition and privacy issues get blurred. I also believe that you should not make a huge tech regulatory agency, because if you have many objectives inside one agency and that they're not compatible, then it's a huge issue. So, I'm Mexican, I'm not American, but I would like more something like what Tim says in terms of a task force in somebody within the government paying special attention and to talk about those regulations that need to be put in place. And yesterday we were talking about, or they were talking about, property data, interoperability, and data portability. And even if it's necessary to have a certain asymmetric regulation and those firms that have substantial power or have certain market level concentrations. So just think outside the box in a task force, not in an agency.
Okay, and did you want to
I
make a
was
quick
just going to
comment?
say something snarky. So,
Oh.
I mean, Luigi's solution, the concentrated tech power, is concentrated government power, right? That's what you want, and I get the idea because of the overlapping. I completely get that, but we should be nervous about that. And then what I heard Dan saying on the ground, the capture issues there.
Yes. Okay, you've
So I'll
actually
stop.
just, no,
Okay, that's
so
fine.
you've teed up perfectly, because I was saying, in the time we have left, two things I want to make sure to hit are the capture issues and how to deal with that and think about that, but also tech nationalism, which is going to play into this concentrated government issue. I mean, something that I'm seeing and hearing a lot, and we saw actually Bloomberg, this didn't get picked up, but Bloomberg, some reporter went up and took a picture of Mark Zuckerberg's notes, on the Hill, and it said, when you're asked about breaking up Facebook, talk about how, you can't break up the big US giants because then the Chinese giants will move ahead. And so there is this kind of, I think, a storyline, and we've touched on it with DOD and other, ways in which there's an embedding of tech with government. Certainly second term Obama, Google was pretty much embedded in the White House. I think we are at risk right now, particularly given political polarization, populism, regionalization in terms of how the regulatory system is playing out, and then the U.S.-China fight of there being actually big government and big tech even more in bed together. So how do we think about all that? Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have an answer at all. We've been sort of chronicling the problem, the work that we do, and it's a big problem. Like whether it's Congress, whether it's administration, tech has implanted itself in government, and it's a really steep hurdle to try to overcome that. And yeah, maybe some of the theory.
Let me ask you, actually, and I want to link the two topics, and these are big topics, and then I want to start drawing people in because I want to see what part of this you want to tease out. Let's talk about academic capture for a minute, because I will say, I've come across, it seems like there's sort of research being done by two sides. There's the research that's paid for by Google, and then there's the research that are paid for by Google competitors. And plenty of people, I'm sure, with ideas in this audience and this table about that.
Sure. So I'll just
talk to that a minute. Yeah.
Sure. So right. I think everyone's familiar with all of the academics that have received funding from Google or their competitors. But I think the larger problem here is that there isn't funding for independent academic research, right? Or if it is, it's hard to get to. It's reduced to a few people. And that would be one good way to solve this issue, is if we could have some sort of independent funding mechanism. Now, as the non-academic in a room full of academics, maybe that's something I'm not well informed about. But I think trying to figure out a way to study this stuff that isn't funded by by corporations would be a solid.
It's actually supposed to be called the university. It's actually what we're supposed to get our salary for. Sorry to say that. I don't mean to disparage anyone, but that is sort of the idea of the university.
Right,
but
sure. So at elite institutions, right, there is that independence, right? Like professors who are at tenured places have a lot of independence, can research what they want. But what we're seeing is that, so we also study the payday lending industry, and they can pay a business professor in Georgia to write a study that they literally edit the paper, right? And then they take that up to government regulators and they say, look, this academic wrote this paper, please pass the regulation that we want. And then the regulators do, right? So sure, maybe at the highest level with the most powerful industries, that's not happening, but it's happening at the minutia level.
I'm not saying it's not happening. I'm saying that it's kind of embarrassing that academics who have these tenured positions, big salaries, still, it's kind of us. We just want to have more money. We're greedy. It's the idea, I don't know, it's a real problem in academia.
Yeah.
It is challenging the basic idea of a university, which is supposed to be independence.
Should there?
Right? I'm just trying to say that thing was created, in medieval or whenever it was. This is a great invention. Let's have a few people who do things supposedly completely independently. But
Go ahead, Luigi.
No, I think that Tim is absolutely right. It's our role, and we are failing at that, and we should think how to fix it, because the funding is only part of the problem. I think that the more serious problem is the opportunities. So if you take a position, now I'm free to take this position because I'm in finance. So nobody ever in Facebook, Google, etc., will ever ask me to consult or be an expert witness in the area, etc., etc. So I'm completely independent only because I have no career opportunity there. Okay. And most people do have a career opportunity and they pay attention. So the problem, most people say, oh, the problem is solved by disclosing funding. I think that's one of the problem. I don't think, especially
in this area is so much the prevailing. Maybe in the medical field is more important, but here that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that if you write against, let's say, since you use the payday lending, against the payday lending, we're not going to consult for payday lenders. And so I think that if you are motivated by money, and it's funny because when I present this argument in front of my fellow economists, they said, "Oh, but we're not motivated by money." Wait a minute. This is this is the only situation which economists are not motivated by money. If you're motivated by money, you know there is more money in saying certain things than in saying others. I'm not saying everybody's paid for, but gee, it would be funny that economists are not affected by this.
Let's open it up to the floor, Matt. Yeah.
So just to make an institutional point, you're talking about how do we create something similar to to FSOC, which is the Financial Stability Oversight Council. This is the sort of council of super regulators to talk, to deal with these new large questions. And I would actually submit that we have one, and we saw it in operation last week, and it's called Congress. And the Senate did a really bad job with their questions, but if you watch the House Energy and Commerce Committee, they were actually really good questions. And it was a really interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot from it. And it was surprising because a lot of them had taken money from Facebook, but they still asked hard questions. I think the dynamic here when you're talking about this is by looking only at regulators and only at the executive branch, you're leaving out this incredibly important question, which is what's the role of democratic deliberation in these questions? Because fundamentally, this is a question of political philosophy. And we have to bring that back into these questions, because when you are engaging in such an industrial revolution with corresponding political revolution, there are political questions at stake. So I would say that we've seen this before, and we have institutions that actually deal with this. The Joint Economic Committee was formed in 1946, along with the Council of Economic Advisors, as a way for Congress to actually think about questions of Keynesian economics, macroeconomic policy, and industrial organization. They did hearings on automation in the 50s. There's a lot of institutional knowledge here about how to do this. So one of the core fixes is to strengthen legislative bodies and to stop laughing at Congress, but to recognize that they make it hard, but so I can't even resist it, and I'm a big Congress proponent, but really to regain a respect for the democratic process in Congress and oversight hearings. And that means bringing more expertise, higher pay, more respect into these democratic institutions. Opening up processes so that you can't just say we close an investigation and we're not going to tell anyone because we don't want to jeopardize trade secrets or anything like that. These are all means of accelerating the problem of narrow specialization instead of opening it up. There's a lot of history here about how to do this, but it really is the case where you have to link these institutions through political philosophy and through legislative bodies.
Okay, Tim, did somebody want to comment to this?
I think it's a good point. I think that, obviously I have a lot more executive branch experience, which tends to make me fall into the trap that you're suggesting. And you already said it, the Congress shoots itself in the foot so often that's the problem. I mean, these hearings, let's, just to take this example, is that going to be it? Right, you know what I mean? I mean, there were some good questions. But if they don't seem to have any, maybe you can come back on this, but if there's no real serious legislative threat, put it that way, or possibility of legislation, then people are they see Congress as kind of you go through that, you just kind of apologize a few times, and that's basically what they're about.
Just to respond, and then I'll come back. Okay, things did happen already. So when the hearing was happening, Facebook announced changes to its advertising policies. So things already happened just by having the hearing. But I think one of the core premises here, and this is why it's a philosophical problem, is it's redefining what is political. So people have since, and again, this back to the Bork Revolution, but since the late 70s, early 80s, you've seen this kind of discussion that industrial organization questions are technical. They're not political. And therefore, politicians don't get asked about it by their constituents, and then politicians also don't see themselves. They're like, that's not a political question. Help us, Mark Zuckerberg. Tell us how to fix this. I mean, that's the intellectual legacy here. So one of the things that is really important here is just to say these questions are not technical questions. These are political questions, and the decisions have to be made at the ballot box.
I think that's a hugely important point, actually. How does the panel feel about that? Let's bookmark, and then we'll come over here for another question. But
I think I said this yesterday. I think I agree. So the desire to solve these problems within antitrust is a desire to do them outside of a democratically accountable process. The democratically accountable place to solve these problems is through Congress. So I think that's what you're saying. And I agree with that.
And just to bolster that point,
Go
too, I
ahead.
think one of the big problems is this institutional problem of Congress, right? And Matt touched on the salaries have decreased. There's no sort of technical knowledge in Congress. Like one of the big things that we need to fix is coming up with bigger staffs, higher paid staffs that can actually take on some of these really technical questions.
Okay.
I feel like I almost have to say that the states are also part of that process.
Right.
As a person who worked for state government some time, and they do tend to act, and people can also make even more fun of the states for various reasons. But yeah, that
Especially
sort of
in Illinois.
double down on your point that the states sometimes get, and the states are starting to draft bills and stuff like that, and maybe that's something we should.
Alejandra.
Well, yes,
laugh about.
I come back to the point that I believe that these technical regulatory institutions, FTC, DOJ, etc., need to know that their technical decisions have political implications. And I come back to the point that it is very important to advocate for efficient markets. So, for example, in the Mexican case, we'll have elections in July. And as an antitrust agency, we did something quite bold. I don't know any other agency that has ever done it before. And some of my colleagues arc their brows, which is we put forward an economic platform with all those things that, in our view, need to be changed through regulation to create efficient markets. So it's not our work, it's their work, but we're all together in this competition issue. So I do
Interesting.
think
Yeah, that's
that
really interesting.
advocacy through antitrust is important in these times.
That is a very good point. There was a question here, and then we'll go back.
Yes, and the question, I'm going to say something, but the question will be, are internet platforms different and need a different approach? And what we're talking about is the internet platforms, and there's two characteristics of the internet that make them different. And that is that the internet is a pervasive input and across industries, across functions. I think we would generally agree with that. They also have two asymmetric things. One is that on a security basis, by design in the late 60s and the early 70s, the internet protocol was designed to be insecure and to not be private. So that's the reason why we have cybersecurity problems. It is an inherent design flaw that can't be resolved in a design. The second one is we started in '96 with an internet policy that was asymmetric that said that internet platforms and internet platforms only were immune from regulation and from liability. And so that goes to the point where you have to look at this holistically because the two underlying drivers of the overall driver of the internet are pervasive. Luigi and
Randall,
Professor
I'm
Pickard,
curious.
thank
Do you have things to say about that? I'm guessing
So I love the
you do.
internet, but electricity is the basic pervasive input. So let's just be clear on that. You watch what's happening in Puerto Rico. And when we confronted electricity, we didn't regulate it through antitrust. We set up a separate regulatory regime for it. So again, it's this question of what we think are the right tools to address these problems. It's important. That doesn't mean it's necessarily something, and it goes exactly to what you were just saying. I love what you just said, which is I'm an antitrust person, but I have ideas about how markets should work, and I'm going to speak to that. We've got these other areas where I think regulation of some of these things is more appropriate.
But I need to come back. When you said, if I can, when you say electricity is like the internet, it's not anything like the internet. The internet is ones and zeros that are ideas, that are speech,
Right,
that
it
are
was a question of
insights.
the importance
They're
of
not
pervasiveness to daily operation.
right. But what the internet is different is it's all about information and not.
Okay.
It's electricity
We
is
can vote
not a
right
good
now. Who wants to
analogy.
give up electricity? Who wants to give up the internet? If that's your choice,
No,
make
that's
a choice.
a false.
I think Robert Gordon does
just
that
not
same
being analogous.
intellectual
You have
exercise.
to be analogous.
Okay, we're gonna stop there. Question back here, and then we're gonna go to Jonathan, and then up front.
Yeah, I want to go back to this question of the role that Congress can play, and push back a little bit on Professor Picker about it feels a little bit like finger pointing, like, well, antitrust can't do this. Do we want the executive branch and the career staff and these appointees to be deciding antitrust? Some of these questions should really be done in the democratic process. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only cynic here, but I worked in Congress for several years, and I mean, the idea of seeing like really meaningful regulation, especially, let's look, one of the biggest threats, Amazon. As soon as they have a giant facility that employs a lot of people in every state, forget about it. You're not going to have that same kind of political discussion. So while I think we can always hold our hopes that maybe Congress can do something, what can the antitrust, how can antitrust enforcers, what ways, and I think this is kind of all about this conference, how can they be thinking more novelly about this to use the tools they have in a responsible way to maybe address some of the things that the political process won't get at, but are the really core to what we care about: competition, innovation, and functioning markets.
Yeah, that's what I've been, I guess, trying to say, and it's in some tension with what Matt's saying. We're friends, so it doesn't matter. But I think that antitrust enforcers and the Bureau should recognize their original and founding role in understanding a political dimension to what they're doing and preserving a certain kind of chosen political ideology, and that came out of the Sherman Acts and reinforced Clayton Act, reinforced 1950 Anti-Merger Act by Congress. So democratic injunctions to be serious about preserving a certain idea of how the American economy works, and that means a little bit what I was saying before, which is understanding the role of antitrust enforcement as being something of a check on. I mean, obviously on monopoly, and obviously on trying to protect competition, but also eventually on the inevitable problems of political over-representation that come with over-concentration. I think this is also related to the tech nationalism question that we never got to, which is such an interesting question.
Yeah.
So it's always been a tension in all levels, both trade and antitrust policy. And Randy kind of referred to it with AT&T and its role in defense. There's always this thing. Well, wait a second. If you break up AT&T, if you break up Microsoft, aren't you just kind of shooting in the United States in the foot? And it needs to go to war with whatever. At one point it was Japan, another point it was the Soviet Union, whoever foreign power. But I feel like we have to understand that we've made a kind of quasi-constitutional choice to think that the American republic lives or dies, maybe a little different in times of war, but on this commitment to a decentralized and competitive economy. And over the long run, even if it looks scary to break up a national champion, that the faith is that that works. And if we want to change that, we can repeal the antitrust laws. That if Congress wants to make a completely different choice, they can go back to square one and say we want a series of state-sponsored monopolies, kind of like what Theodore Roosevelt said he wanted in 1910, the new nationalism, that we want every industry to be run by a monopoly, and like China, basically, and regulated by the state and subservient to the state, but a monopoly that's incredibly powerful. We could have that, but I think if you want to have that, you got to repeal all the antitrust laws. And I think there's a lot of content in that early phase of, and frankly, the entire presidential election was fought over this issue. So it's not as if this was like, kind of a random thought of some bureaucrat somewhere. This was like a founding vision of the progressive era, and also reaffirmed very powerfully post-World War II, the Truman administration and the passage. You read the congressional history of the anti-monopoly law of 1950. It's all about we need to be different than Germany and Japan, who relied on this sort of fascistic industrial cartel system. And they thought it was really powerful, but we're choosing a different way. That's why we need to stop mergers in their incipiency, which they put right into the language, so we don't. It was very political motivation, and you can repeal all that, but until then, I think we got to trust that in our approach to tech nationalism.
Alejandra.
Yes, as an enforcer, I would say something we, of course, cannot forget is we need to act by the law. So we need to be very careful in that sense. But if you act by the law, you can always be very cautious. Within that framework, you can always be very cautious, and you can always lean in. It's harder to lean in, but I think in this time, we need to lean in, because as we take these cases to the limit, then what we create is precedents, which is important. So the application of competition policy moves forward, and then we also create incentives to investigate certain issues. So if you break a company, then you'll have at least one scholar analyzing if that is the divestiture was correct or incorrect, and what should be done. So as enforcers, we need not to forget to be bold.
Okay, Jonathan, you've been waiting. And
Oh, I think I have the mic, so
Oh,
I'll
I'm sorry.
I'll
Go
be
ahead,
really
Fiona.
fast. I wanted to bring us back to the regulatory capture issue. I think we've been separating out regulation and antitrust, which is correct, but we might want to think about more creative ways to put them together. So, for example, if you have, when I was at the Department of Justice, there would occasionally be something that would happen where another agency would ask for the DOJ's opinion on whether something was anti-competitive. And we would write them a letter saying, yes, it most definitely is anti-competitive, it's going to harm consumers, and they would throw that letter in the trash and go on about whatever it was that the industry wanted in that agency. So you could think about laws that, for example, require one of the two agencies or both to publicly comment on a new regulation if we don't think that OIRA is enough of a hurdle. And that would bring more antitrust focus, then if you thought there was capture, if you thought that there were, anti-competitive forces trying to convince Congress that something was good, at least you might have a countervailing force. So I think more creative ideas like that would be helpful to creating this kind of balance.
Go ahead.
Definitely, and it's interesting because in our political platform I was telling you about that we put forward for the elections, one of the things we're proposing is a presidential decree where all secondary regulation that is leveraged by them, it has to have a non-binding opinion, but a public opinion from the competition agency.
Yeah. Fiona,
So
I think it's a great, sorry, guys, I think it's a good idea to do more. I don't think OIRA as it stands, despite the best efforts of Howard Shalansky, really thought or was equipped to do that kind of thing and adjudicate. I think it's a missing function in the U.S. government, is this, I guess, taking antitrust policy and competition policy into the other parts of the regulatory state. It's sort of a missing part. And I think something we were trying to create, obviously we lost the election, so we didn't have a chance to implement any further. But that was a big idea, and I think that's a very fertile area to think in the future.
Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
So I want to go back to the role of capture and pick up what Matt was talking about, which I think is really critical. I think tech has posed itself to the politicians as some kind of magic trick, and that it's different. They don't seem to have any problem ruling about energy policies or stuff like that, but somehow you don't understand tech. And so, and I would say even maybe to Tim, even Obama seemed to think it was kind of magic. Right. I was at a conference last year that Kara Swisher runs called Code, and Mark Andreessen gets up and says, in 10 years, the entire U.S. long-haul trucking fleet will be automated. Just flat out statement. And he was as sure of it as possible. So I'm waiting in the green room. He comes off the stage, and I said, well, what are you going to do about the 5 million people who are driving trucks now? He says, that's not my problem. That's a political problem. And yet, there's nobody in Congress who's trying to think about that eventuality. And our Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin, says, this won't happen for 100 years. The possibility of AI and robotics causing great unemployment won't happen for 100 years. It's not even on our radar. So Andreessen says it's 10 years, and Mnuchin says it's 100 years. I'm betting on Andreessen. And so I don't know how we get, and maybe I directed to Daniel and Tim, how do we get them out of thinking that this is some magic thing that these guys do, and look at all the wealth they've
Which,
built.
by the way, was also a theme in the financial crisis. But
I mean,
go
and
ahead.
that's a good example, right? I think there has to be some disaster. There has to be some shift in public opinion, because it's not just politicians, right? It's
But it didn't. But 2008 didn't shift the idea that bankers were able to argue that this, the financial system is magic, and they need to do business with 95% debt and blah,
right.
blah,
Yeah.
blah.
So we didn't solve all the problems, right? But there was a change. There was Dodd-Frank, right? There were changes, and I see until we have some sort of disaster, until we see some sort of shift out in the heartland, I don't think that's going to happen.
Can I pose and I'm curious what folks think of this. Are the moves to shift tax structures to account for the digital economy useful in the sense that you could actually maybe capture some more revenue and start funding government a little better and make it more possible to take on these issues? Luigi, what do you think about that?
I think that certainly if you can tax more effectively, that would be a good idea. I'm not so sure that they will let you do that. I think that, first of all, the mood of this particular president is not to increase taxes any.
Well, even in Europe, let's say. I mean, when we think about how we can, just fight back against government capture, is that one way? Where is the low-hanging fruit here?
I think that there are no low-hanging fruits. There are a lot of margins where you can improve. I think that paying better people in Congress and other places is important.
Singaporean model?
Yeah, it's not the only way. And I don't think that you can only fix it by money. But when the distance between the salary you take in as a congressional staff,
right,
or as in House counsel or whatever, and the salary outside is a factor of 10, then it's
campaign finance reform? Like, help me out here.
But campaign finance reform is, in my view, hopeless in the short term.
Yeah.
Unless you go for a constitutional convention, which is not my cup of tea. I think that I don't see any margin. But I think that is relatively low-hanging fruit to increase that. The second is improve academia. I think that what Tim was saying is very important. We are responsible for that. We should do a better job on this. And by the way, if we don't self-monitor, somebody is going to regulate us. That we should learn from other industry. I think the media have a responsibility there too. Okay, and the problem that there is in the congressional staffer is in the media multiplied by a factor of n, right? Because if you move from where you are to become a PR for a firm, you increase your salary by a large multiple. And so I think that that is an important consideration. So we need to work on the stuff that can be worked relatively easily. And then if we can do campaign finance reform or other things, great. But let's start doing this.
Yeah.
Can I say something about that academic point? It's a sensitive topic. People don't like talking about it. Here's my proposal. We have an advocacy system for many of our disputes, including antitrust. So to say that you can't have works of advocacy, it would be a little strong. And I watched Carl Shapiro gracefully, beautifully handle a cross-examination last week. And to say that we can't have academics involved in this, and you have to just get some random guy off the street to do that would be deprive, particularly the legal system, of a lot of talent. But what we really need is a very clean line between advocacy work and academic work. And that line, like a Chinese wall, and that line is crossed all the time. And look, I think no one in this room is fully innocent of that. That line, the difference between sort of essentially lawyerly work and essentially stuff that's purporting to seek the truth in an independent way, that Chinese wall has to be restored. And it's kind of embarrassing what we've allowed our profession to become, because we are funded. Look at the endowments of Harvard, Chicago. These are exactly what you're talking about. These are the institutions which are formed, promote independent research. But what percentage of the research is actually corrupted, particularly around antitrust, one way or another? An embarrassing amount. And I'm calling us out right now on that and saying we are, it's humiliating actually, that we have this amazing, incredible resource. Donors have given millions of dollars, or billions over the years to, promote the search for truth, and we, for relatively small amounts of money.
Can I add one thing? I completely agree with you 100%, and let me give you an example outside of this arena, but where this is enormous. There was a former dean of LSE who was
hired by the Monitor Group with other academics, some American, to help Gaddafi make his regime be more effective. And this guy went around and wrote articles in the Italian press, the Spanish press, the English press, saying that Gaddafi was a better man, that he has changed. This was around 2004, 2005. We only know about this because Gaddafi fell and this stuff has been disclosed. And the fact that you can write articles, opinion piece in the newspaper without disclosing that you are on retainer to do that thing, to me that's terrible. And we should ostracize from the academic community whoever does that.
Okay, so more transparency. Comment here, and then we'll go over.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated and hard issue because reputation is the only control mechanism we have within the academic community, and it doesn't work well. If you publish something and sign your name and indicate support, then the community will judge whether or not you've been unduly influenced. I would also say, by the way, that the notion that you should never take corporate support for research doesn't make any sense because there's data, there's information, you learn stuff. So the notion that you should sit in your office and opine on complex issues without talking to people involved or being supported by people involved. Well, if you
Take
want
their data, not their money.
I mean, you know, why would they talk to you? Just for fun? No, they talk to you if they think what you write might be useful. The thing that it works badly, let me just say, is testimony that's not public. And I have seen very, very embarrassing testimony put in on a variety of issues by people with good reputations, and there's no consequence. There's really no consequence. And I don't know how to fix that.
Oh, I think it's very simple. I try to advocate this, but of course I can't nothing, so nobody. I think that there should be a delayed disclosure. So every testimony, for whatever reason, cannot be immediately disclosed. But if you know that 5 years down the line will be disclosed, you pay more attention. Because a colleague from the law school told me that there was a case for tenure that came up, and somebody had a piece that was quite sloppy. And his defense was, oh, I thought you understood I did it for money. So the fact that this is the standard, this is what we need to change in academia.
I agree with you there. We need to change that. I'm not sure delayed disclosure will do it, but it
It's
is,
better than
it
nothing.
is, I think, a real problem.
Yeah, I
Okay,
agree.
Luther.
I wanted to talk about a different type of capture, which I've observed kind of around the globe as I work on the Google issue, and it's that of civil society. And whereas in Europe there is robust engagement by organizations like BEUC, which is their consumer group, and their formal complainants in antitrust cases, it doesn't seem like the same level. It seems like there's the same type of capture that's the subject of this discussion that applies to many groups that purport to sort of represent consumers. And I'm curious of Alejandra's perspective of if in Mexico you see engagement by civil society organizations. Just curious because I'm fairly ignorant of whether there is that type of engagement. And Tim, who sort of is the father of net neutrality, which saw so much outpouring of activism and participation by these groups who one would think might be more active on some of these issues, but happen to take six-figure checks from these large tech companies.
Yep, good point. Alejandra, do you want to?
Yes, no, in Mexico we don't have a lot of civil society organizations pushing these issues forward. We don't have a strong citizenship culture. But what I see in the U.S., you have a president who a year ago said he was going to look on these big companies, and then you have the Zuckerberg case, and then you have Europe immediately bringing into force on May 25th its information regulation. So there's a wave. So you guys should keep on pushing.
Okay, Tim.
There's
Yeah, I think it's
there's a window.
Oh,
of
I'm sorry.
opportunity.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
there's
ahead.
a window of opportunity.
So Arthur C. Clarke, I think it was him, said that any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But there's kind of a corollary to that, and I think this sort of explains some of this magical influence and also sort of civil society, some of civil society's enrapture with new technologies. But there's a corollary, which is that any significantly old technology starts becoming indistinguishable from garbage. And or maybe electricity, maybe that'd be a better point, is it starts to seem unmagic. And I think that process is actually happening. You know what I mean? I mean, this conference is part of it. I don't think that members, we're here sitting here, and I think it would be a very different conversation 15 years ago. When there was a greater state of sort of rapture. And if you look historically, at the radio industry, or if you look at telephone industry, electric industry, they do get their magical periods. The point is really just to not let it last more than, say, 15 or 20 years. I think you get it's actually part of a natural infant industry subsidy. Because you get this kind of magic effect, which somehow stuns legislatures into giving you immunities and so forth. But everything should be written, knowing that you're going to be transfixed by the magic, is everything should be written to expire after 10 years. All the laws in a new industry should expire after 10 years, when it'll no longer seem like magic, and instead seem normal. Because there's something to be said for the basic subsidies, they're effectively subsidies they gave out. But we're reaching the end of that, and this conference is part of it. So that's what I feel.
Do you
now
see
you're going to
any
say yes, but what
evidence
about
of
the
that?
funding?
I mean, I think
Right.
last week was a great opportunity for folks like EFF and others to step forward, but everybody was AWOL. There was actually a great article in Slate last night posted about how much money all these groups get and how everybody was MIA last week, with the notable exception of open markets. I mean, do you see any evidence or have any optimism that the public knowledges of the world are going to jump in and endorse a Google or Facebook
you're
antitrust
exactly
case?
right. And it's why, just as in the nonprofit world, there needs to be an overturning. You know what I mean? There need to be an Open Market Institute is a new group, right? I mean, there need to be groups that are. I don't think you can expect a group that has fed at one nipple for a very long time to turn on its mother. How's that?
Okay. On that note, Elvira,
So one thing you learn in these criminal investigations is follow the money. So here we have, it seems like, Dan, you talked about how there's such an imbalance in lobbying, and then you talked about, is there a possibility for civil society to do something? But it just seems to me that it's like, these huge companies with massive amounts of money going against unarmed civilians. Are there any other groups, and Luigi, you mentioned, a few other groups that could help. Who else has the money to pay for lobbying to counteract this massive influx of cash that my lobbyist friends say they've never seen? One of my friends says, who's not a tech lobbyist, he says to his tech lobbyist friend, he said, hey, look, we used to rent congressmen around here. You guys buy them.
Yeah? Comment?
I think that, look, first of all, if the industry, and that's one of the if the industry is fragmented enough, there is competition in lobbying. In a sense, the Google Transparency Project is financed by competitors of Google. So there is nothing bad about it. That's why the free market economy works. The problem is when it's too concentrated. That's one of the reasons it's too concentrated. But I think that rather than pontificating on what we cannot change, because I don't think we're going to change campaign financing anytime soon, I think we should focus on what we can change. We are in academia. And as Tim said, I think we have a responsibility. Honestly, the only reason why I can justify to myself that I have tenure is if I say something controversial, because otherwise there's no point for me to having tenure. And I think we should remember this, that we are paid, and we are paid well, in an independent way. We have all this benefit from society, which, by the way, in my view, sometimes that might be excessive, because all this, former D, no. Again, the only way to justify to ourselves and to society is that we behave and we do something good for society. And I think that is incumbent upon us to act.
Okay, so for the last 5 minutes, I want to have a speed round, since we've covered so much ground. Everybody gets like 30 seconds to say, what is the key idea that we've just discussed in terms of how we can think about the political economy, lobbying pressure, big tech's influence on Washington, that you want folks to take away? Randal, go.
I thought Fiona said was good. So I'm in favor of identifying a top 10 list of 10 small changes we can make. I'm good with that one as number one.
Okay. Alejandra.
Yes, I bring it down a little. 10 is too much.
Okay. It's shrinking already. Go
Yes,
ahead.
and as a competition agency, advocate and be bold.
Luigi.
I reserve at the end to give my suggestions.
Woo! Okay, that's bold. All right, Dan.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to make a call for activism in the political process, Congress, civil society groups, these other groups. That's sort of what we have to turn to. That's what it's going to take.
Okay, Tim.
I want to, no one can disagree with what Fiona has to say, but I want to leave this group with the idea that industry concentration and political influence, even political corruption, undue political influence over the political process are linked, and that one of the commands of antitrust and one of the commands one of the ideas of what this country and other countries is about is understanding the threats of undue concentration, not just as an economic matter, but as a political matter. So that's where I want to reorient our thinking, that when we think about industry concentration, we think about all these problems of capture, we think about them, they can all be traced to a problem of too much concentration or maybe bigness.
Okay, Luigi, last word to you.
No, at the end of the conference.
Oh, at the end. Oh, you're not gonna. Okay, all right.
So I keep people around, hopefully.
Exactly. So now you have to wait. Well, listen. Thank you guys so much. Awesome panel. Thank you.
This was great. Thank you very
good.
much.
Thank you so much.
you so much.
Yeah. Cheers. Cheers.
And by the way, I have to explain to you because they didn't explain. You know what this is? So as a double function of being a key card that you can use.
Oh my
I was
God.
sitting
Is
next
that
to you.
tracking me now? You're getting paid by
in
Google
fact,
and speaking of that.
in fact, inside there is.
So a quick announcement. I'm Daniel Goroff. I'm from the Alfred P. Sun Foundation. We support research on science, technology, and economics. And we've been very concerned about scholarly access to administrative data. So we've been working to try to lower those transaction costs for research on private and proprietary data. And we've been doing that by supporting various kinds of intermediary institutions like Quiz here, and also working on the mathematics of privacy. Now, for years, one of the hardest companies for independent scholars to deal with has been Facebook. You can speculate on why this has changed in the last few weeks, but the Sloan Foundation has been part of a consortium of funders that has just recently reached a deal with Facebook to make accessible to scholars their data for certain research purposes. So there'll be a whole multi-step process that goes along with this, and there'll be an RFP that will come out, but there are 3 quick points that I wanted this community in particular to know. First of all, it'll be guided by a very high-level senior faculty committee. And if there are nominations for that committee, it's being assembled right now. And let me know if you think that you know someone who might be appropriate for a role like that. Secondly, think about research questions that either you or someone else really should be answering if you had access to Facebook data, because there will be a process of collecting and reviewing these questions and then making them part of the RFP. It'll be mostly about elections, mostly prospective, but there will be a chance, I think, to do economic research and other kinds of research and perhaps even experiments. Third, let me just say that if you have questions about this, I'll be at lunch, I'm around. So let me know, because I want to thank Matt and his colleagues at Facebook. This is an unexpected opportunity, and I think that as a community we should really work hard to make good on it. Thanks.
Okay.
So inside there is a movie, and then all the episodes so far of capitalism.